Chapter 30 of Paul the Dauntless. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Leeson. Paul the Dauntless by Basil Joseph Mathews. Chapter 30. I appeal to Caesar. By the wild glare of torches 70 horses were led out from the garrison stables. Their hoofs clattered up the stone way under Antony's tower. File after file of footmen gathered there till 200 soldiers, with their broadswords and the bosses of their shields reflecting the yellow torchlight, and 200 spearmen, together with 70 horse soldiers, stood ready for the night march out on to the Judean hills. They were a host of men to guard Paul. But the band of fierce Jews had vowed to slay him before they ate or drank, and such a vow meant that he must be prepared for a swift and violent attack. The captain of the guard knew that in any gateway cloaked and armed figures might be standing, hidden in the shadows, men who would gladly die to kill the man whom they knew to be the greatest enemy of the narrow Jewish belief. The captain knew also that to allow the Jews to slay a Roman citizen who was in his charge would bring on himself the punishment of Caesar. It was for these reasons that he made ready this guard of 470 soldiers for Paul. Paul swung himself astride his horse. There came the sharp word of command, followed by the rattle of arms as the men moved forward through the darkness to the city wall of Jerusalem. The gates swung slowly open and the shod feet of the horses on the flagged road echoed under the vaulting of the great archway. They were out on the open road. The men who plotted to kill him were balked. They now must either waylay him in the hills or themselves die of starvation, or break their vow to kill him before they fed again. As Paul felt the night air on his cheek, when they came through the gates, he would pass the place where, as a young man, he had stood guarding the clothes of those who stoned Stephen. It would be strange if, in the darkness of the night, the memory of that day did not flood across Paul's thought and flush his cheek with shame, mixed with a strange joy that now he himself was among the persecuted Nazarenes. His horse breasted the hill. Surrounded by the guard of soldiers, he pressed on along the north road, over the rocky shoulder of the Judean hills, bearing westward through the dark defiles. They all knew that the enemy might leap out from behind some boulder. If any ambush had been prepared, however, the plotters remained hidden, overawed by the force guarding Paul. Did the ancient spirit of the proud little tribe of Benjamin leap in him as they passed by Gibeah, where his great namesake, King Saul, had lived? By the time the dawn came up they had outdistanced all probable danger of ambuscade, for the hill country was past and the plain lay before them. But the force of soldiers went on, dropping gradually toward the plain by the Roman road. Then, crossing the valley of Ajalon, by the road which ran parallel with the Mediterranean coast, they came out to the fortress and town of Antipatris, where a halt was called. Both because all serious danger of attack was gone and for the sake of greater speed in travelling, the 400 foot soldiers turned here and marched back to the castle at Jerusalem. The 70 horse soldiers with Paul trotted forward more swiftly than before, along the northern road, with the hills of Samaria rising on their right, and on their left the slopes dropping to the Mediterranean plain. At last, turning west, they left the rocky hills and gained the soft land. To their left lay the shining yellow of the sand dunes, and beyond the sand the glittering ripples of the Mediterranean. Cantering over the ridge they came in full sight of Caesarea, with its theatre and stadium, its white marble temples and, beyond, jutting out into the Mediterranean itself, the square grim mass of the citadel. Headed by the captain of the troop they rode straight to the house of the Roman governor. When Paul was ushered into the presence of Felix, the representative of Nero himself, the captain felt in his tunic and brought out the roll on which Claudius Lysias, the chief captain at Jerusalem, had written his letter to the governor, to whom he now handed the parchment. Felix read the letter, which ran, "Greetings from Claudius Lysias to the most excellent governor Felix. This man was taken by the Jews, who would have killed him, but I came with soldiers and rescued him, for I had been given to understand that he was a Roman citizen. Wishing to know what charges they brought against him, I took him before their (the Jews) council. I found that he was accused of breaking their law, but that he was not charged with having done anything that called for punishment by death or even imprisonment. When I was told that the Jews were lying in wait for this man, I at once sent him to you. I have also instructed his accusers to lay their case against him before you. Farewell." Felix read the letter through, and looking up, scanned with curiosity this man, who, though a Jew himself, had fired the Jews with such hatred, and who was also a citizen of Rome itself. "To what province of the empire do you belong?" he asked. "To the province of Cilicia," answered Paul. "I will hear your case," Felix announced, "when your accusers have come down from Jerusalem." Then turning to his officials he said, "Keep this man in Herod's judgment hall." Paul waited and watched for 5 days. Then another cavalcade rode into Caesarea from Jerusalem, headed by the high priest of Jerusalem himself, the greatest man among the Jews and Paul's most powerful enemy. A skillful barrister named Tertullus rode with him. Paul was led into the great hall. Felix was seated there in his marble chair of judgment on a raised platform, and beneath him were his secretaries. There stood the lictors carrying the axes of authority. Soldiers guarded the judge. The bearded high priest, in his robes, sat in dignified silence. When Paul was led to his place behind a marble balustrade, Felix signalled to Tertullus to open the case for the prosecution. Tertullus, with the subtlety of the Oriental orator, began his speech by attempting to flatter the judge and then to prejudice him against Paul. "Most noble Felix," he began, "we always and in all places live under your rule with thankfulness, for it is through you that our nation enjoys great quiet, and it is by your forethought and provision that great boons come to us." We can imagine that Felix, who was used to this kind of pleading, would wave his hand impatiently as though saying, "Get to the business before us." So Tertullus hastened on. "Nevertheless, in order that I may not weary you, I pray that in your clemency you will listen to a few words from us." Then, turning and pointing with scornful finger to Paul, he began his attack, saying, "We have found this man a pestilent fellow, a mover of rebellion among all the Jews throughout the world, and," he sneered, "a ringleader in the party of the Nazarenes. He has also gone about to profane the temple, so that we took him and would have judged him according to our law, had not the chief captain Lysias come and, with great violence, wrested him away out of our hands. Lysias told us to come and lay our case against him before you, so that you might have the whole charge before you." Felix asked the other Jews there whether the accusations brought by Tertullus against Paul were true, and they all nodded their heads and said yes. Felix now turned to Paul and beckoned to him to speak. Paul began with an art even more skillful than that of Tertullus, by suggesting that the long experience Felix had of the Jews of Judaea, and especially Jerusalem, would have taught him the lengths to which their fierce religious jealousy would carry them. "I answer for myself all the more cheerfully," he began, "because you have been a judge for many years over this nation. It is even now only 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. They did not find me disputing in the temple with any man, nor raising the people into ferment, either in the synagogues or the city itself. They have no proof whatever of the charges they bring against me. But this I confess to you, that I worship the God of my fathers, believing all the things which are written in the law and the prophets," sweeping his hand toward his accusers, and adding with a touch of scorn, "after the way that they call heresy. And I hold the same hope that they do toward God, believing that there is resurrection of the dead. And I am always most careful in these matters to avoid offense toward God and men. I have been away for many years, and came bringing gifts and offerings to my nation, when some Jews from Asia found me in the temple. I had cleansed myself and done all the acts of purification. I was with no mob nor any tumult. These men ought to have been here to bring charges if they had any against me. Either that, or let those who are here, belonging to the Jewish council, say whether they found any evil in me while I stood before their council." Felix could see that the evidence against Paul was altogether too flimsy and vague to make it possible to condemn him. Accusation and denial were pitted against one another. So he deferred the case till an impartial witness like Claudius Lysias of Jerusalem should come down. He called a centurion to him and said, "Guard Paul, but give liberty for his friends to come to visit him." Seeing how poor the evidence was against Paul, it is possible that Felix would have found him not guilty of the charges brought against him and would have set him free. But he was not a strictly just man, and, like many other governors of Roman provinces, he wished to be bribed with money before he would set prisoners free. His wife, too, was a Jewess named Drusilla, and he may have kept Paul from going free in order to please her. One day Felix and Drusilla sent for Paul to go to their house, as they wanted to hear from him more of what he believed. Passing the Roman sentry at the gate, the guard led him through the courtyard, where reflections from the sparkling water gleamed on the marble pillars, to the governor's hall of audience. Paul, prisoner as he was, spoke boldly and with fiery eloquence and strong reasoning. He laid before Felix and Drusilla such a picture of pure, temperate strength, and such a splendid ideal of manly straightness, he spoke with such awful power about the punishment of the unjust and the unclean, that it seemed as though he were the judge and Felix the man at the bar of judgment. And Felix trembled. His conscience was awakened. He shrank from the picture of himself that he saw. So he said, "Go now, for this time. When I have a convenient opportunity I will call for you." For 2 whole years Paul was kept at Caesarea, waiting the pleasure of Felix. He would wander guarded in the busy streets among the jostling throng of people coming and going. He could see men of many nations in this Roman town on the Mediterranean seaboard of Syria, Romans from Italy walking with all the proud confidence of conquest in their bearing, brisk Greek merchants, dignified Arabs of the desert in cloaks of orange and red and brown, bringing merchandise down from the east on the slow-stepping, soft-footed camels, bearded Jews looking out at their Roman conquerors from under their bushy eyebrows with ill-concealed hate, and swarthy Egyptians from the Nile. As an educated Jew, born in a city whose university was famous for its school of Greek philosophy, trained under the greatest tutor in Jerusalem, yet also by birth a citizen of the whole Roman Empire, Paul, with that loved companion and strong physician Luke, who stood by him through these hard days, may well have been the only men in all Caesarea at that time whose mind and experience were broad and deep enough to take all these varied people into their sympathetic understanding. The great citadel stood with its foundations on a sea-smitten rock, as though it would rule the waves as well as the land. On either side of it is a bay, where the sea runs over yellow sands. Paul, as a prisoner guarded, would pace these sands north and south out to the rocky headlands, while the Mediterranean rippled at his feet, or in the winter its breakers boomed on the great curving breakwater, which almost enclosed the harbour. The ships of the Empire came there, and as he watched them set sail again out of the harbour into the shining seas, bound for Rome, the resolution that had held Paul for a long time became fixed. He too would go to Rome, even though it were as a prisoner, and carry his burning message to the very heart of the world. At last his opportunity of doing this came. At the end of 2 years Felix was recalled to Rome, and a new governor, Porcius Festus, sailed into the harbour at Caesarea. Within 3 days of landing Festus rode up to Jerusalem. Immediately the high priest and the chief men among the Jews, striking swiftly at Paul, went to Festus, told him their story, and pleaded with the governor to get rid of Paul by sending for him to be tried in Jerusalem. Their plan was to place an ambush among the hills behind rocks on the way and have Paul slain. Festus, however, refused. He said, "I am going down to Caesarea shortly and will try him then. Let those among you who are able to leave go down with me, and bring your charge against this man." Within a fortnight's time Festus went back to Caesarea, and on the very next day took his seat in the judgment hall, and ordered Paul to be brought before him. Again the Jews laid their charges against him, but could not prove them. Again Paul said, "I have not broken at all the laws either of the Jews or the temple or Rome." "Will you go to Jerusalem to be judged by me?" asked Festus. Paul saw the peril from the Jews in Jerusalem. He trusted the Roman justice. His opportunity of reaching Rome had come. He seized it swiftly. " I stand," he said, pointing to Festus, " at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. If I have done anything worthy of death, I am ready to die. If there are none of these things of which I am rightly accused, no man may deliver me into their hand. I appeal to Caesar." Chapter 31